No, okay. I mean, we're being streamed online, so we have to speak into the mics when it comes around to bringing everyone in. Thank you very much for coming. We're very privileged today to be hosting Bernard Wood, who has recently completed, along with his team, the evaluation, 5-year evaluation of the Paris Declaration, what they're calling the campaign, which is, I think, a new word for the vocabulary, one of the many new things coming out of this evaluation, the campaign for aid effectiveness, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. Bernard is incredibly eminent. He was the founding CEO of the North-South Institute in Canada. He was Director for Development Cooperation at the OECD and was head of the DAC Secretariat during the launch of the Global Aid Effectiveness Agenda. And he spent the last 5 years of his life, among other things, I'm sure, managing a process which has produced a really fascinating report. I've read it cover to cover. That doesn't mean I'm going to remember all of it. I expect some of you have as well. And I came up with at least 15 different really new things that I, if I was making a presentation, would want to talk about. And that is a lot for a report, I think, of this nature. So it will be a challenge for Bernard to keep to his 20 minutes. We're also very pleased and equally privileged to have Alison Evans, who's the director here at ODI. Doesn't need much of introduction, but it's not that often that we get her to do a comment of this nature, so we're very pleased to have her as well, and she'll comment first. Then we'll have, hopefully, plenty of time, getting on for an hour, to discuss this with everyone, bringing questions from those of you who are watching around the world. There may be some. But without further ado, can I introduce Bernard to give his presentation?
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you, Alison, for welcoming us on reasonably short notice, because we figured that we had finally got the report out in English, and I was going to be on this side of the Atlantic, and we should reduce carbon footprints where we could, and this is a wonderful opportunity to start the dialogue. So this is the first of many presentations, we presume, that will lead on the road toward Busan. Just a word to say what a pleasure it is to be back at ODI, my once sister think tank. When ODI was but 15, it was part of the inspiration for the North-South Institute, and continues to thrive and diversify, I see. So I'm delighted to be here. Let me just, before I plunge in, recognize a number of my colleagues from the team. The UK team colleagues are here. I don't see Julian. Is he? He's on his way. Okay. Julian Gayfer from IOD Park was the project director. Julia Betts is one of our key colleagues, the guardian of the evidence, I call her. And we have Marika Weinhardt, who actually is now with IIED, and she was actually the brains of the entire operation, kept us on track. And Juliana Hayek, who worked with us in the early stages on the bibliographical side. And also just mention Helen Wedgwood here, who was the indefatigable UK coordinator for this entire complex exercise. Thank you all for being here. I will plunge in, and we could talk about methodology for a couple of hours if you wanted to. We can talk about how this was all done in countries, how it was done in donors, but I think it is time for the bottom line, and let's start there. And if I figure out exactly how to do it, not that way. Which one?
Is it the arrow?
I don't know.
Page down.
Oh, down.
There we go. The central message. So after all this very, very large, elaborate, complex exercise, we are able to conclude that the global campaign to make international aid programs more effective is showing results, but the improvements are slow and uneven in most developing countries, and even more so among most donor agencies, although the changes expected of them are actually less demanding. I will elaborate on those propositions as I go through this, but I think it's worth noting it. Jonathan had picked up on the term campaign, and I will also explain why and how we got to that, rather than saying, a set of edicts dropped from the heavens in 2005 in the form of the Paris Declaration, and how did it change the world. That was obviously a very shallow and not very useful view to take. So you'll see why we came to a slightly different construction of that. The key evaluation questions we asked, the main framework, and I should stress this was an enormous and fully participatory exercise. Even the definition of these questions was carried out through a process of regional workshops with participants from all the participating countries, subsequently the teams, and there was a little disjuncture, unfortunately, between the initial coordinators and then the evaluation teams, and this is one of the mechanical challenges of actually managing a complex evaluation of this kind. But we intentionally put the question of the context as a major evaluation question in itself. What are the important factors that have affected the relevance and implementation of the declaration and its potential effect on aid effectiveness and development results? In other words, it was not to say, let's have just the normal chapter up front which mumbles about context. Recognize, and this was one of the findings of the first phase evaluation, very strongly, that context matters an incredible amount. And we stressed that all the teams should do really serious analysis on the political economy of aid and aid reform within their countries. And a number of studies actually came back at the end, and the team leaders said, you know, we've actually learned new things by really taking this seriously and working it through. Second question was then, to what extent and how has the implementation of the declaration led to an improvement in the efficiency of aid delivery, the management and use of aid, and better partnerships? Well, that was the definition of improvements in aid effectiveness. We broke it out in more detail, which you will see briefly to come. And then the final longest leap: has the implementation of the Paris Declaration strengthened the contribution of aid to sustainable development results? And if so, how? This, we knew from the very, very beginning, was going to be methodologically extremely difficult, and furthermore, intrinsically extremely difficult. After 5 years, in terms of development results, and as most people in this room would know very well, talking about development results and their causation in itself is an enormously complex issue. And then to say, try and trace the influence of this was going to be a major challenge. You'll see how we decided to try and grapple with it. On context, aid and aid reform in the bigger picture. Diversity is the rule. The campaign proved relevant to many different countries and agencies, but differently. Jonathan and I were just having a little debate a second ago about what patterns there might have been between, say, different income levels, different levels of aid dependency. The answer is not many. We looked very, very hard, and we were pressed very hard to say, well, we'll come up with those patterns. And interestingly, behaviorally, they do not leap out. The commonsensical assumptions about how countries are going to behave based on some of those variables did not bear out. Importantly, all of the actors were engaged in aid reforms before 2005, but some were much more advanced than others. So this is another reason for saying, you know, this didn't drop from heaven in 2005, and you have to figure out how you manage to assess the effects in that broader context. The limits of aid and aid reforms. The evaluation highlights the other powerful influences at work in development and the realistic limits on the role of aid. And I just mentioned that I'm regretting I'm not going to be able to stay later this morning for a session on taxation, which I think is the kind of critical issue that is too often ignored or underestimated in discussions of aid. You know, particularly in a number of our countries, we still have this naive assumption that aid is some kind of magic bullet or major lever that is going to make all the difference. It never makes all the difference. Sometimes it makes some of the difference if it's very well done or badly done. The key political, economic, and bureaucratic influences in the events, and I enumerated a number of them, have shaped and limited the reform process in partner and donor countries, as well as shaping aid and development. And so these effects of different contexts come out repeatedly, and so do questions about the changing nature and roles of aid alongside other resource flows and other relationships. Now, in that regard, I mean, as I just mentioned, the issue of taxation, some of the diversifying economic relationships, trade and investment trends and so on, all very key. The one other that I think, frankly, has got a little bit more attention than it merits in some ways is the role of the new donors, and how do we find the right term? It's not new, it's not emerging, but the donors who are not yet part of the Paris Declaration kind of family or alliance as donors or providers of aid. Everybody's talking about it. It has behavioral implications already in a good number of countries. Overall, in terms of its sheer magnitude, it is overestimated. We actually commissioned a small study to say what is really happening in terms of concessional resources. And it's less than 25% in all probability of what comes from traditional sources. So it's, but very, very key in terms of stimulating different kinds of thinking, different kinds of relationships, different kinds of behavior. And I think Busan is going to be a very important milestone to say, is this alliance, this global concern, this global commitment widening? Will new actors come in with new approaches and new influences that will be taken into account in the next phases of improving aid? To try and graphically represent some of these realities about context, from early on we came up with what we call the egg diagram, and you see there's a tiny inner yolk there. The tiny inner yolk is actually the aid influenced by the commitments of the Paris Declaration. The aid partnership more widely, if I can turn this thing, turn the right thing on, I can't, is that green oval, the wider overall development processes, and you know, in most countries actually the aid component would be an even smaller part than is shown there, and then a huge set of other national and international influences and forces shaping what goes on in there. So keep it all in perspective is the message there. The aid reform campaign, another diagram which was worked out on the fly as we went around the world discussing this with all our participants, and people saying, well, we were doing this before 2005, we were doing that. It's like, yes, and these are relevant to the whole picture. And what really you have to see is all these tributaries feeding into what in fact became a great global river by the time of the Paris Declaration, where these strands came together. And we can talk about what happened when that occurred. Where it goes from here, who knows? You know, you could be flowing into the sea and changing the planet. You could be running off into the ground. You could be drying up. Who knows? You could be diverting again into different rivers. But I think this is an interesting way of recognizing that you have to look at the sources when you're trying to evaluate where all this came from, particularly because countries were at very different positions along the way. Okay, the contributions to aid effectiveness. This has pulled together and focused global attention on ambitious, experience-based measures to improve development cooperation and aid. It's clarified the roles of aid and better aid to some degree, strengthened global norms of good practice, helped progress toward the 11 outcomes that were set in 2005, which I'm going to talk about in a second, improved the quality of aid partnerships, and has, in fact, supported or undergirded rising aid volumes. And we note that there is better progress in general among partner countries than among donors who, with some striking exceptions, have been too uncoordinated and risk-averse to live up to their commitments. In terms of the 5 Paris principles, country ownership has advanced the furthest. Alignment and harmonization have improved unevenly. Mutual accountability and managing for results are lagging most. In our judgment, action on mutual accountability is now the most important need, backed by transparency and a realistic acceptance and management of risks. Just to touch on the 11 intended improvements. we grappled for months to try and find the handles to assess this properly. Principles were too wide. That was what we did in phase 1, just looking at early implementation. And the 56 commitments were too many and too specific. The 11 monitoring survey indicators were samples of those which were already underway on a different track, the monitoring track. And as we grappled to try and find manageable ways of looking at, in the end, we actually looked back at the Paris Declaration. Not a bad idea. And it said at the beginning, logically enough, why we are doing this. What are key identified problems? And we just looked at those and said, yeah, there were 11 of those. And if you turn those around and say, these are the things we'd like to resolve, what would it look like if they were resolved? This was your 11 intended outcomes. And that was the spine of our analysis on the aid effectiveness improvements. That there was a very clear experience-based definition of aid effectiveness problems, and we had the means of trying to measure solutions. These are very different magnitudes, it should be said. The majority of them, a clear majority of them, are more donor responsibilities than partner country responsibilities, but the sheer numbers don't reflect the magnitude and difficulty of achieving them. We have in the report, this is a sample of a very key diagram, and it's really quite important to recognize that, I must try and get this thing, there we go. Well, it's not working anyway, right? If you look at the very top, we recognize there were different starting points, that gray area. So in terms of these different intended outcomes, the first one, stronger national development strategies and operational frameworks at the national strategic level, most countries were quite far along in 2005 in terms of that starting point, that gray area. The pace and extent of change, the green area, says what has happened since 2005. And you'll see it, I should say exceptionally, that the majority, this darker area within the green, have actually got very, very close to the intended outcome there. The range of the green, though, reflects that a good number of partner countries are further back still. But that dark area is the block. And the little arrow at the end is the distance remaining. On the next one, the detailed operational strategies, you'll see that countries were less far along and have progressed much less, with a few leaders really striking out ahead in that lighter green area, but the bulk somewhere much further back. And then on a primarily donor commitment, increased alignment of aid with partner country priority systems and procedures. You see, once again, a low starting point and very little progress overall, with a few who have done quite a bit better in terms of that lighter green. So that's a way of conveying the real complexity of this picture, that it's a very varied performance among the different outcomes and among the different actors involved. And, you know, when people have pressed us to say, well, give us the easy answer, how are donors doing, how are countries doing, you just have to say the variety has got to be grappled with. And that's not to say you can't say anything significant or do anything significant, but you've got to grapple with it. Conclusions on aid effectiveness. Uneven progress toward the 11 outcomes set in 2005. We clustered them under the Accra priorities, although I have to tell you that we found very little evidence that the Accra priorities had been fully absorbed as yet and shaped behavior substantially. It has been improving the management and use of aid, improving the quality of aid partnerships so far. There could even be some contrary trends just shaping up right now. And has supported, there was a better word in French, which we never found the proper substitute for in English, to sort of undergird the rising aid volumes. We're not saying this caused rising aid volumes, but it did provide an underpinning for them. On the other hand, no evidence of reduction in aid burdens, or very small evidence of reduction in aid burdens or improvements in efficiencies in a narrow sense. Now that's when you ask that question in those terms, balanced by a better quality of aid overall. Finally, most of the 2010 timeframes were unrealistic. The expectation that was built in, and you know, I don't want to be unfair about this. Nobody said it's all going to be over by 2010, but the expectations for how much could be done by 2010 probably a political calculation was made there. You've got to keep their feet to the fire and sort of hold some hard targets. But you also then have to grapple with the disappointment when you don't get there on many of them. Contributions to development results we assessed in 4 key areas, and we did this through a 3-question sequence. First, were development results achieved in these particular areas? Second, did aid contribute? And for those 2 determinations, we were in all our country studies, we were working from other evidence. Obviously, we weren't going to do those analyses ourselves. But third, then, if aid did contribute, did aid reforms plausibly strengthen the aid contribution? And we thought that was a respectable way of trying to grapple with that very thorny issue. And we are using contribution analysis. We are not attributing, but we are looking through a fairly rigorous lens at the plausibility of contributions. The 4 areas chosen were results looking at a sectoral level, and health was the main case study, and a number of reasons why that was chosen. I just mentioned the other: priority to the needs of the poorest, especially women and girls. The third was strengthened institutional capacities and social capital. And fourth, not really a development result as such, was improving the mix of aid modalities. But we can describe why why those were chosen in the end. I am very, very glad in retrospect that there was a determination to go for a particular sector study, and there were good reasons and not biased reasons, I don't think, for choosing health. But it was very important in order to get some kind of reasonably in-depth standard coverage across this wide number of 22 countries, essentially, that you had one sectoral focus. And in fact, we found that declaration type measures have contributed to more focused, efficient, and collaborative aid efforts in health, which counters a little bit that general sense that the efficiencies have not been improved. In this sector, clearly there was an efficiency improvement seen in most of the countries. These efforts have already contributed to better development results since 2000-2005 and should be sustainable. Pathways of improvement are indirect but clear. There was not wide enough coverage of other sectors to draw strong conclusions. Priority to the needs of the poorest, and here you come to a recognition of the limits of aid and of aid reforms, that if there is not the commitment in the countries to trying to grapple with profound, ingrained inequalities, you are not going to transform this world by aid or by aid reforms. There is evidence, even against some of the constraints, and a number of countries have made real progress, but even in others, that aid was pushing in some of the right direction, and declaration reforms were pushing in the right direction. But basically, you were working with severe limitations unless there was that profound commitment domestically. Strengthening institutional capacities and social capital. Recognition first that insufficient capacity is still a central obstacle, and aid could help more than it does to improve that situation. Modest contributions can be found by aid and reforms to the long-term strengthening of institutional capacities. And there's actually clearer evidence, which is counterintuitive for some people, of contributions to modest improvements in social capital, in other words, to wider capacities in society. And finally, improving the mix of aid modalities. I guess one of the key findings and conclusions here is there's no such thing as an optimal mix of aid modalities. And the assumption in many minds, and in fact in at least one of the monitoring survey indicators, that more program-based aid was necessarily and always a good up to 100%. It was not found borne out in any country. That was not really either realistic or a strongly felt preference by any country or any donor. So a mix of aid modalities has continued to make sense for all actors. That's one we have to handle quite carefully, and it will lead to much debate. Overall conclusions, we had another slice to look apart from those 4 across the board. The relevance of the declaration and its implementation, it has proved relevant, but in different ways, different degrees, taking into account the different starting points. For partner countries, slow and varied implementation, but overall reforms have now generally taken hold. The reason they have taken hold is not just to manage aid better. it is in fact because you can't get some of the profound changes that are looked for just to manage aid better, but because in fact they do serve some wider national needs and make sense. Momentum has held up in reform in developing countries, in our group at least, through political change and crises. And this is really quite an interesting finding, because you have some countries that have gone through quite some transformations, and this still makes sense for them, which is kind of interesting. For donors, much more uneven implementation. With some striking exceptions, most donors have been risk averse and slow to make the less demanding changes expected of them. Peer pressure and collective action are not yet embedded in their systems. Then the nature and place of aid itself is changing. The new actors, new forms of cooperation, new partnerships needed. I've gone a little longer than I'm supposed to, but I'm getting there. Main recommendations. I have to say, a number of these are not new. They may be familiar and seemingly obvious, but key political actions have to be pressed again, simply and starkly, because they are so important. They are firm Paris and Accra commitments that have not yet been met. So I'm sorry if we bore anybody by coming back and saying, hey, you just actually haven't done this. So before you move on, before you say it's failed, how about trying to do what you said you would? Joint recommendations to decision makers in both partner and donor countries. Get to the political level. These are political choices. These are big enough changes that bureaucrats can't make them. And therefore, you've got to get that political will engaged. And a number of the actual political choices spill out below, but that to get it and keep it at a political level is critical. Focus on transparency, mutual accountability, and shared risk management. A grown-up approach to risk, to recognize that risk is real, is inescapable, rather than some of the nonsense we hear about zero tolerance for risk and so on. Center and reinforce the aid effectiveness effort in countries. It has absolutely got to go back to countries rather than floating around at an international reform level. That is where the difference is made. That is where the different contexts make all the difference, and therefore having it centered in countries is critical. Work to extend the aid reform gains to all forms of development cooperation. In other words, the other actors, the CSOs, NGOs are not fully engaged, a number of other key elements in that. And reinforce the improved international partnerships in the next phase of reforms. This is recognizing that actually this process has produced a much stronger partnership effort. It has gone beyond the traditional sort of donor-recipient dichotomy and had some collaborative behavior. And whatever is next done to carry this forward, it has to maintain those gains. For policymakers in partner countries, only 3. Take full leadership and responsibility at home for further aid reforms. Set strategies and priorities for strengthening capacities. We have walked around the capacity development challenge for decades. We're still walking around it. It is not something that's subject to a quick fix or a bureaucratic solution, but the ability to try and move this ahead in a serious way is absolutely critical, not only in terms of aid reforms, but obviously in terms of the fundamental capacities, particularly the public sector. And intensify the political priority and concrete actions to combat poverty, exclusion, and corruption. For policymakers in donor countries and agencies, recognize we're at a really key milestone. We have actually achieved an improved tone in North-South relations over what has happened for several decades. And we are poised either to push the next step forward or to slip back. We say there's no going back. There's no going back in expectations. The expectations for a better relationship around aid have been improved, and they will not be set back. Therefore, they either advance or they will blow up. And I think we could seriously be facing that kind of situation now. For donor countries, face up to and manage risks honestly. As I say, the assumption that you can say we will have a zero risk policy, a zero risk approach to corruption and working with countries, to try to avoid risks in development cooperation is to risk being completely irrelevant. It's almost certain to guarantee your complete irrelevance. And admit failures, to recognize when things go wrong in a grown-up way and say we fix those. Now that that, as I say, we think probably on balance, most of the donors, not all of the donors, but most of the donors are further back in terms of their agenda of managing these kinds of things than the partner countries are. And apply peer pressure to free riders for more balanced donor efforts. The unevenness of the donor efforts is undermining what this campaign was supposed to be about, because this campaign was supposed to be about a concerted effort with a country working with its partners in a much more organized way. The partners taking responsibility to organize, harmonize themselves, and they have done such a poor and unbalanced job in that regard that some have been carrying the burden. And I would say, when we have to be quite careful here, because one of our major limitations is we do not have, nobody has, a sufficient basis for comparing the performance of donors. But a number of donors have been carrying a disproportionate share of the load, and to date at least, this country has been one of those. And, doing community service, but how long can you expect in real political economies that a few key leaders are going to keep carrying those burdens when others are essentially both dragging them down and in some ways undermining the effort? So a much more balanced donor effort is necessary. We identified, you can't take the think tank out of the man forever. We had to identify at least a dozen key areas for further work needed beyond the declaration. I'm not going to start talking about those now, but we can if you like. Okay, very, very rapidly. The background, process, and limits. Why there was this independent evaluation? This was pledged and built into the declaration itself, a very good idea. 2 phases, fully joint. It happens, I was a participant and a couple of my colleagues, not all of our colleagues, in both the synthesis for phase 1 and phase 2. The evidence-based 22 country evaluations led by partner countries and managed in country. 18 donor agency headquarters studies, which had a different methodology, which was in the end not a great thing. 7 supplementary studies on key topics, plus the literature obviously. We have the list of the countries which we can come back to if you like. This was the components from the phase 1 evaluation up through the supplementary studies, donor headquarters studies. That we had updates from a number of the donors, including the UK, all leading toward the synthesis. The process, we had a matrix developed for country studies, applying those 11 outcomes, as I said. Integrated evaluated quality assurance and peer review, recognizing the limits of aid in development and applying contribution analysis. A targeted process of guidance and support, recognizing the primacy of the country studies. The country studies were the foundation of phase 2, which is the most important. And my colleagues on the team worked very, very hard, and as I say, we had workshops and individual sessions. We did a count at one point, Julian, and it was, I can't even remember, and his air miles are just incalculable at this juncture. But it was really important to try, and we have lessons to draw from this experience of what it's like to try to manage a complex evaluation at this level in 22 countries all around the world. And an international reference group, and I'd said to Jonathan earlier on privately, that in fact our governance structure was really quite effective. It was a very good way of managing the participation and the quality assurance and protecting the independence of the exercise overall. Key limitations: how do you actually do this, evaluate the effects of a political declaration? Traditional approaches were not appropriate. Limited time elapsed. No comprehensive data from the country studies on the multilaterals and the donors. Different methodology for the donors, which was carried over from the first phase. And self-selection of those who were participating, which, at a theoretical level could lead you to have a real concern about a selection bias. We examined for it and said, well, is there any evidence that only the good performers were coming forward? And no, there's not. We grapple with it, and we do not think it's a critical limitation in itself, but it's certainly worth noting. Oh, that doesn't even show up where they were, but they're oh, there they are. Oh, goodness gracious, it's more sophisticated than I am. That's where it was, and I'm going to leave this up because these documents in English are all online, and I think in French